Simple woman stabbed 5 times protecting veteran. Next day, 10 Navy SEALs showed up for her. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't serve in the military. And yet, one evening in a quiet park, Anna Morris lived out the very creed that defines America's warriors. You never leave your own behind. She was walking home from work when she saw them. 2 young men crowding an older gentleman wearing a faded Navy cap. No one else stopped. But Anna did. What followed was 5 knife wounds, a hospital bed, and a chain of phone calls that traveled farther than she could ever imagine. From one veteran's voice to another, her story moved, until it reached men who understood exactly what her choice had cost her and what it meant. 24 hours later, 10 Navy SEALs walked through the doors of Pine Hollow General Hospital, not for a parade, not for publicity, but for one reason only: to thank a simple woman who had stood for one of their own. The hallway of Pine Hollow General Hospital was still, the kind of stillness that comes in the early hours when the night shift is winding down and the morning hasn't yet stirred. Then came the sound. Boots, not sneakers, not the soft slip of a nurse's shoes. These were heavy, deliberate, steady. 10 pairs, moving in 2 perfect lines, each step in sync like the tick of a metronome. They turned heads long before they reached the nurse's station. The sight of them, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in crisp navy dress blues, was enough to draw silence from every corner. One nurse froze with a pen halfway to paper. A man in a wheelchair rolled himself to the wall just to watch. Even the ever-present hospital beeps and hums seemed to dim under the weight of their arrival. At the front walked a man whose presence needed no introduction. The silver at his temples spoke of years in service, and his eyes carried the calm focus of someone who'd seen things most people couldn't imagine. Commander Jonathan Blake didn't scan the hallway. He didn't need to. His attention was fixed ahead, on a single door at the end of the corridor. Room 214. Inside, Anna Morris lay propped against 2 pillows, the white hospital blanket pulled neatly over her legs. Her brown hair, still tangled in places from the day before, was pulled back loosely. A clear 4-line trailed from her arm to the bag beside her bed. Bandages wrapped her right forearm from wrist to elbow, and under her gown, narrow strips of surgical tape pressed against the wounds in her side. She heard the boots before she saw them. At first, the sound was distant, almost blending into the hum of the machines. But it grew louder, closer, until it filled the room like a drumbeat. She turned her head toward the doorway just as the first shadow appeared. They stopped together, 10 men in 2 lines, their posture perfect, their faces set in a way that said they hadn't come here for ceremony or show. The lead man stepped inside. His shadow stretched across the bed. "Ma'am." The word was measured, his voice deep enough to carry without raising it. "We came to thank you." Anna's breath caught. Her eyes flicked to the hallway where the others stood, motionless, their hands at their sides, their eyes locked forward. She looked back at him. I don't understand," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. "You don't know us," Blake said. "But one of ours knows you. And we don't forget things like that." She blinked, unsure whether this was some sort of mistake. I just did what anyone would do." He let a pause stretch between them, the kind of pause that forces truth into the space. "No, ma'am. Not anyone." From inside his jacket, he pulled a folded American flag. The edges were sharp, the creases exact. It was the kind of flag that's carried in ceremony, presented in moments that carry weight far beyond the fabric itself. He held it, but didn't offer it yet. Anna's brow furrowed. "Why would you?" "Because you stood for one of ours," he said. "And we stand for you." Her eyes dropped to the flag, then back to him. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker, though neither of them had moved closer. She searched for words, but found none. The truth was, she didn't feel like a hero. She didn't even feel brave. 24 hours earlier, she had been just Anna, a waitress at Mabel's diner, a daughter caring for her elderly mother, a woman living in a town where everybody knew where you sat for coffee. She had never worn a uniform. She had never been trained to fight. And yet, when she saw a man in trouble, a man wearing a faded Navy cap, his hands trembling as 2 strangers closed in on him, something inside her had moved before she could think. She hadn't counted the risks. She hadn't thought about the knife until it was already in front of her. By then, it was too late to step back. And she wouldn't have anyway. Now, That split-second choice had drawn 10 of the most elite warriors in the country to her hospital room. Blake studied her for a moment longer, then glanced over his shoulder at the men waiting in the hall. "She's the one," he said simply, though not for her benefit. The words were for them. They didn't react, not outwardly. But there was something in the way they stood a little straighter, in the way one of them let his eyes drop for a heartbeat before returning them to the front. Anna's gaze went back to Blake. She still didn't know what to say, and maybe she didn't need to. The truth of why they were here was written in the silence, in the fact that they had come without cameras, without reporters, without any need for recognition. "Rest," Blake said finally. "We'll only take a moment." He set the flag gently on the table beside her bed, as though it might break under careless hands. Then, without another word, he stepped back toward the door. Anna watched him rejoin the line, the 10 men turning as one. The boots began again, their sound fading down the hall until it was gone entirely. Only then did she let her shoulders relax against the pillows. She glanced at the flag, its folded edges catching the pale light from the window. She reached for it with her good hand, feeling the smoothness of the cloth beneath her fingers, the firmness of the fold. 24 hours earlier, she hadn't known these men existed beyond the stories people told. Now, she knew something else, that what she'd done in the park had mattered. Not because it made her a hero, but because it told them something they understood deeply, that you don't leave your own behind. And she hadn't. Before her name carried weight outside the borders of Pine Hollow, Anna Morris was known for simpler things. She was the one who worked the early shifts at Mabel's diner, the one who knew exactly how much cream each regular took in their coffee. She could balance 3 plates in one hand, refill mugs without spilling a drop, and somehow still remember to ask about your grandkids. Pine Hollow was the kind of town you could cross in 5 minutes if you caught both traffic lights on green. It was tucked between 2 low ridges, its main street lined with buildings that hadn't changed much in decades, a grocery store with creaky wooden floors, a barber shop that doubled as a social club, and Mabel's diner, where the morning rush started before dawn. Anna had never wanted more than what fit between those ridges. She lived in a small clapboard house on the edge of town with her mother, Ruth, whose health had been slipping for years. The nights were quiet there, except for the hum of the old fridge and the wind in the trees. Life wasn't easy, but it was steady. Her days began before sunrise, starting the coffee at the diner before the first farmers came in from the fields. She'd work through breakfast and lunch, walk home in the late afternoon, then spend the evening cooking dinner for Ruth, sorting through bills, and tending the small garden in their backyard. To anyone watching, hers was an ordinary life. And she liked it that way. But ordinary didn't mean she was timid. There was a steadiness to Anna that didn't waver, a quiet sort of stubbornness. She didn't make speeches. She didn't seek attention. But she had an unshakable sense of where she stood on things. And once she took a side, you couldn't move her from it. That stubborn streak showed in little ways. Like the time she'd chased a stray dog down Main Street to pull it away from traffic. Or the way she'd step in when teenagers got too loud at the diner. Not by yelling, but with a look that stopped them mid-sentence. She never raised her voice unless she had to. She didn't need to. It was that same streak that had drawn people to her over the years. Ruth called it the Morris backbone, though Anna never thought of it as anything special. To her, it was just the right way to be. Still, nothing in her life had prepared her for what happened that Tuesday evening. She'd been working a double shift that day. The diner had been busy, a bus tour had stopped in unannounced, and she'd spent most of the afternoon on her feet, carrying tray after tray. By the time the clock neared 7, she was tired, her feet sore, her apron heavy with coins from tips. She left through the back door, the sky just starting to dim to that soft blue of early evening. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the clouds were still far off. She cut across the small park that separated Main Street from her neighborhood. It was a shortcut she'd taken hundreds of times. That's when she saw them. 2 young men, maybe mid-20s, standing too close to an older man sitting on a bench. The man's shoulders were hunched, his hands up in a small, defensive gesture. A cane lay on the ground beside him. Even from a distance, Anna could see the faded navy cap on his head. She slowed, watching for a moment. The younger men leaned in, their voices low but sharp. One of them shoved the old man's shoulder. He tried to stand, but they crowded him, their bodies blocking his way. Something twisted in Anna's chest. She glanced around. There were people in the park, a couple walking their dog, a teenager on a skateboard, but no one was stepping in. Most were pretending not to notice. She started walking toward them. Her pace quickened. "Hey," she called. "Leave him alone." Both men turned. The taller one laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Mind your business." Anna didn't stop. She could see the older man's face now, pale, anxious, the lines around his eyes deepened by fear. "Get away from him," she said, her voice low, even. The second man stepped forward. That's when she saw the knife, small, but sharp enough to glint under the park light. "You want trouble, lady," he said. Anna's heart pounded, but her feet stayed planted. "I'm not letting you hurt him." The older man's voice wavered. "Don't." But it was already too late. The first strike came without warning. The blade caught her forearm as she tried to shield her side. Pain exploded down her arm, but she didn't move back. The second hit landed between her ribs, stealing her breath. Then came the third, the fourth, the fifth, each one a white-hot jolt, the world narrowing to the attacker's face and the gasps of the man behind her. Somewhere, far away, she heard a shout. Sirens wailed in the distance. The attackers ran, their footsteps fading into the dark. Anna's knees buckled. She felt herself sinking toward the ground, her good hand pressed against her side, warm blood seeping between her fingers. The old man knelt beside her, his cane forgotten on the ground. "Stay with me, stay with me." His voice was thick, urgent. Her vision blurred, the edges dimming. She wanted to answer, to tell him she was fine, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing she heard before the sirens grew close was the sound of his voice calling for help. Anna woke hours later in a hospital bed, the ceiling unfamiliar. Her arm ached. Breathing pulled at her side. Beside her, Ruth held her hand, eyes red. The police came, asked questions. She answered what she could. The man she'd stepped in for, Henry Lawson, though he told everyone to call him Hank, was a retired Navy corpsman, 72 years old, living alone since his wife passed. He came to see her the next day, leaning heavily on his cane. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Anna smiled faintly. "I know." What she didn't know was that Hank had friends, and those friends had brothers. Some still served. Some had traded their uniforms for civilian clothes, but their bonds ran deep. News of what happened in Pine Hollow spread fast, faster than Anna would have believed possible. By nightfall, calls were being made to places Anna had never been, to people she'd never met. 24 hours later, 10 Navy SEALs would walk into her hospital room. But for now, she was just Anna, a simple woman with a stubborn heart, sitting in a hospital bed, unaware that the choice she'd made in the park had already begun to ripple far beyond Pine Hollow. The day had been long. By the time Anna stepped out of the diner's back door, the smell of brewed coffee and fried eggs clung faintly to her clothes. She pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders and drew in a slow breath. The air was cool for early spring, the kind of cool that whispered of rain later in the night. Her route home took her through the park, a shortcut she'd taken so often she could picture every bench, every lamp post, even the dips in the path where puddles always formed after storms. The evening light had turned soft, the sky washed in pale gold fading to gray-blue. She was halfway across when she noticed them. 2 men stood near the center bench, too close to the figure seated there. The older man's shoulders were rounded forward, his cap pulled low. From this distance, she couldn't hear the words, but she could see the posture, one man leaning in, the other blocking the path. Something about the scene tightened her stomach. Her steps slowed. The man on the bench shifted, trying to stand, but one of the younger men pressed a hand against his shoulder, forcing him back down. That was when she saw it, the cane lying on the ground at his feet. She kept walking, her eyes fixed on them. The sound of her shoes on the path seemed loud now, deliberate. "Hey!" Her voice carried more sharply than she expected. "Leave him alone." Both men turned at once. The taller one smirked. "Mind your business." The older man looked at her, his eyes wide, a warning in them. He wore a faded navy cap, the brim frayed. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Anna's pace didn't falter. "Get away from him." The shorter of the two stepped forward, and that was when she saw the knife. Not large, but enough to catch the light from the nearest lamp. The blade looked too clean, too ready. "You want trouble, lady?" His voice was low, almost mocking. Anna's heart thudded hard in her chest, but her feet rooted themselves to the ground. "I'm not letting you hurt him." The older man found his voice, strained and desperate. Don't. The word hadn't even finished leaving his mouth before the first strike came. The knife flashed and caught her forearm as she threw it up to shield herself. Pain shot white-hot through her arm, but she barely had time to register it before the second blow drove into her side. She gasped, the air knocked from her lungs, but still she didn't move back. The third strike came fast, ripping at her sleeve, cutting deeper into her ribs. The fourth and fifth were a blur, her vision tightening to a tunnel of movement, pain, and the sound of the older man's voice shouting her name, though she couldn't remember telling him what it was. Somewhere beyond the pounding in her ears, she heard footsteps, someone running, and then the wail of sirens. The attackers' heads turned at the sound. Without another word, they bolted, vanishing into the dark edges of the park. Anna's knees buckled, her good hand pressed against her side, the warmth of blood seeping fast beneath her fingers. She sank toward the ground, the cold of the pavement seeping into her skin. The older man dropped to his knees beside her, the effort making him wince. He grasped her shoulders gently. Stay with me, stay with me." His voice was rough, urgent. Her lips parted, but only a shallow breath came out. The edges of the world blurred, the lamplight overhead, the faint outlines of the trees, the distant blue flash of approaching police cars. "I'm fine," she tried to say, but it was barely a whisper. The sirens grew louder. Footsteps pounded closer. Someone shouted for a medic. The last thing she felt before everything tilted into darkness was the weight of the older man's hand on her shoulder and the trembling in his voice as he called for help. When she woke, the room was bright, and the first thing she saw was the ceiling, white, unfamiliar, dotted with a single vent that hummed softly. Her arm ached in a deep, throbbing way, and her ribs burned with every breath. She turned her head and found her mother, Ruth, sitting in a chair beside the bed, holding her hand tightly. "Hey, honey," Ruth said softly, though her eyes were rimmed red. Anna tried to sit up, but a sharp pull along her side stopped her. She looked down and saw the edge of the bandages beneath the hospital gown. Her arm was wrapped thickly, a small line of tape peeking from the dressing on her ribs. "What happened?" she began, but the memories came rushing back before she could finish. The park, the knife, the older man in the navy cap. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. The man himself stepped inside, leaning heavily on his cane. His cap was still on his head, his face lined with age and something softer, gratitude. "Henry Lawson," he said. "Hank, to most." Anna nodded faintly. "You're okay?" "I'm okay," he said. "Because of you." She shook her head. "You didn't need me." "Yes," he interrupted gently. "I did. And you didn't even think twice." She didn't have an answer to that. She didn't know how to explain that there hadn't been a decision to make. She had simply acted. Hank stayed for a while, talking quietly. She learned he had served as a Navy corpsman during Vietnam, patching up the wounded in the field, carrying stretchers through jungle mud. Now, decades later, his body was slower, his hands sometimes shaky, but his pride in his service was still clear in the way he wore his cap. When he left, he paused at the doorway. "I'll be back," he said simply. She didn't know it then, but by the time the sun set that night, Hank's story, her story, was already moving far beyond Pine Hollow. He called an old friend, another veteran, to tell him what had happened. That friend called someone else. Within hours, the details had reached people Anna had never met, men who didn't live anywhere near Pennsylvania, but who understood the weight of what she'd done. They didn't talk about it in speeches or post it on social media. They didn't make plans for ceremonies or fundraisers. They simply passed the story along to those who needed to hear it, those who knew what it meant when someone stood between a threat and one of their own. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, a commander read the account and stopped what he was doing. His men listened in silence, and without hesitation, 10 of them volunteered to make the trip. Anna had no idea. She sat in her hospital bed that night, drifting in and out of sleep, unaware that a convoy was already forming, that the sound of boots in a hospital hallway was less than a day away. The first full morning in the hospital came slowly. Light spilled through the narrow blinds in pale strips, catching on the edge of the metal bed rail. Anna woke to the muted sounds of the ward, the shuffle of soft-soled shoes, the distant ring of a phone at the nurse's station, the low hum of voices passing in the hall. Her body ached everywhere. The deep ache in her ribs pulsed with every breath. Her right arm felt heavy, the skin beneath the bandages pulling when she shifted. She turned her head and saw her mother, Ruth, still in the chair beside her bed, chin resting in her hand, asleep. A newspaper lay folded on her lap. For a moment, Anna thought about how strange it was that life could shrink so suddenly. From moving around the diner, talking to regulars, walking home through the park, to being confined to a single bed, every movement accounted for. She was used to being in motion. Sitting still made her feel exposed. The door opened quietly. Hank stepped in, his cane tapping softly against the linoleum. He'd traded his navy cap for a plain wool one, but even without it, she could still see the way service lingered in him. The posture, the steady eyes. "You're back," Anna said, her voice rough. "Promised I would," he said, easing into the chair Ruth had vacated when she slipped out moments earlier for coffee. He set a small paper bag on the table beside her bed. Inside was a sandwich from the deli down the street. "Hospital food's never worth the effort," he said. Anna smiled faintly. "Thanks." He didn't speak for a moment, just watched her, the way someone does when they're trying to gauge what's been lost and what's been held on to. "You know," he said finally, "I've seen men take wounds in battle and keep moving. But I've never seen anyone step in the way you did without thinking twice." "I didn't think," she said quietly. "I just saw you there, and I couldn't walk past." "That," Hank said, "is exactly the kind of thing my brothers need to hear about." She didn't understand what he meant at the time. To her, the incident was something that had happened, something that was already behind her. She didn't think of it as a story that could travel. But Hank did. When he left that day, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to Tom Garcia, a man he'd served with in the early 70s. Tom now lived in Virginia, not far from a naval base. Hank told him the whole thing. The park, the knife, the way Anna had taken hit after hit without backing down. He didn't leave anything out. "You think the boys need to know about this?" Tom asked when Hank finished. "I do," Hank said, "because she didn't just protect me. She stood for all of us." Tom didn't waste time. His next call was to a younger man named Mason Carter, a retired SEAL who had stayed connected to his old unit. Mason listened without interruption, only asking for Anna's name and the name of the hospital. By the end of the day, the account had passed through a chain of voices, veterans, active duty men, and those in between, until it landed in front of Commander Jonathan Blake. Blake had been in a meeting when the message came in. It was short, stripped of anything unnecessary. Civilian female, multiple stab wounds defending retired Navy corpsman. Stable condition. Pine Hollow, PA. He read it twice. The room around him seemed to fade into the background. In his world, there were many kinds of bravery, the kind born of training, of discipline, of muscle memory. But there was another kind too, the kind that came from instinct and character. That was harder to explain, but he knew it when he saw it. And from the sound of it, Anna Morris had it. He looked up at the men in the room. "We're going," he said. There were no questions. 10 men volunteered immediately. Not for publicity, not for headlines, but because they understood the weight of the gesture they were about to make. Back in Pine Hollow General, Anna knew none of this. The hours blurred together in a rhythm of nurses checking her vitals, her mother adjusting her blankets, and Hank appearing like clockwork each afternoon. He didn't talk much about the attack itself. Instead, he told her stories about long nights on base, about the stubborn kid from Ohio who could fix anything with duct tape, about the time he'd carried a wounded Marine half a mile through mud because the chopper couldn't land closer. She listened, not just because the stories were good, but because she could hear something in his voice. It wasn't pride exactly, but something older, something built over years of shared hardship. One afternoon, she asked him, "Why do you still wear that cap?" He chuckled. "So my brothers can find me," he said. It wasn't until later she realized he didn't just mean the men he'd served with. He meant anyone who understood what it stood for. That night, as she drifted toward sleep, she thought about the moment in the park, about the way the knife had flashed, the shock of each strike, the way the sirens had seemed both impossibly far and too close all at once. She thought about what might have happened if she'd walked a little faster, if she'd taken the other path home, if she'd decided it wasn't her problem. The thought made her stomach turn. She didn't regret it, not for a second, but she wondered if the men who'd attacked Hank were still out there. She wondered if they knew her name now. Sleep didn't come easily. In Virginia, Blake and his men were already on the road. They didn't travel in uniform, not for this. They wore civilian clothes, but the way they moved still marked them. In the quiet hum of the convoy, none of them talked about why they were going. They didn't have to. They all knew. For them, showing up wasn't about ceremony. It was about presence. It was about making sure Anna knew that her actions had been seen, and that in their eyes, they mattered as much as any act in uniform. By morning, Pine Hollow General was waking to another day. Nurses rolled in carts. The smell of coffee drifted through the hall, and sunlight spilled across the floor. Anna was still asleep when Hank arrived, but he stayed anyway, sitting quietly in the chair by her bed. He looked at her, this woman who had stood between him and a blade, and thought about the men he'd known, men who'd died in service, men who'd been honored with medals and folded flags. And he thought about how honor didn't belong only to those in uniform. Sometimes, it belonged to a diner waitress from a small town who refused to walk away. When she woke, he didn't tell her that by tomorrow, she'd be meeting 10 Navy SEALs. He didn't tell her that somewhere down the hall, a nurse was already talking about the unusual number of visitors scheduled for the day. Some things, he thought, were better as a surprise. Commander Jonathan Blake had been at his desk for less than an hour when the message came in. It wasn't long, just a few sentences typed in the plain, clipped style he was used to. Civilian female, multiple stab wounds defending retired Navy corpsman. Stable condition. Pine Hollow, PA. No other details. No flowery language. Just the facts. He read it twice, then a third time, the words sinking in deeper with each pass. In the years Blake had served, he'd read hundreds of reports about acts of courage. Most came from battlefields or training grounds. But every now and then, a different kind of story found its way to his desk. A story about someone with no weapon, no uniform, and no obligation, who still chose to stand when it mattered most. And those stories always caught his attention. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the short message. Pine Hollow was a small town, the kind of place most of his men had never heard of. But he knew the weight of what had happened there. A woman, a complete stranger, had taken 5 knife wounds to protect one of his own. He didn't need to know more to decide. "Listen up," Blake said when the team gathered in the ready room. The men straightened in their seats. There was no idle chatter, no questions yet. They could read his tone. He told them about Anna Morris. He told them about the park, the knife, the retired corpsman she'd defended. He didn't embellish it. He didn't have to. The facts were enough. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then one man said, "When do we leave?" Blake looked around. Every hand went up. "We'll take 10, he said. They began to move immediately, no need for further discussion. The men packed light, civilian clothes, no visible insignia, but their posture, their discipline, their unspoken coordination would mark them no matter what they wore. This wasn't about making a scene. There would be no press, no announcement. This was a matter of respect, and respect didn't need an audience. Meanwhile, in Pine Hollow General, Anna was in her 3rd day of recovery. She'd learned to time her breaths so they didn't pull too hard at the stitches in her side. Her arms still throbbed under the bandages, but the pain was sharpest when she tried to lift anything heavier than a glass of water. Hank visited every afternoon. He never stayed long enough to tire her, but he made sure to be there. He brought her magazines, a new scarf his late wife had knitted years ago, and stories from the diner regulars. She didn't know that behind the easy conversation, he was keeping in touch with Tom Garcia, who was keeping in touch with Mason Carter, who was in constant contact with Commander Blake. She didn't know that the trip had already been planned, that a route had been mapped, and that 10 men were on their way to Pine Hollow right now. The convoy moved quietly, 2 SUVs and a van, heading north through rolling countryside. Blake sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his mind running over the details he'd been given. The attack had been unprovoked. Anna hadn't hesitated. She'd stepped between the threat and Hank Lawson without knowing who he was or what could happen to her. In his line of work, that kind of instinct was rare. He thought about the men under his command, about the times they'd faced danger with the same reflex. Not because they were told to, but because it was the only choice their hearts would allow. And now here was a woman from a small Pennsylvania town who carried that same fire without ever training for it. He didn't know what he'd say to her yet. Words felt too small for something like this. But he knew they needed to stand in front of her, even if only for a moment, so she'd understand what her choice had meant. In the hospital, Anna shifted restlessly in bed. The doctors had said she was healing well, but she hated the stillness. Her life before this had been constant motion, coffee pots to refill, orders to take, errands to run for her mother. Now the hours stretched, each one feeling heavier than the last. She didn't know it yet, but by this time tomorrow, her room would be filled with the quiet presence of men who'd traveled miles just to look her in the eye. Late in the evening, Hank called Tom again. "Are they coming?" he asked. "They're already on the road," Tom said. "Should be there in the morning." Hank let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "She's not going to see it coming." "That's the point," Tom said. "It's not for show. It's for her." By dawn, the convoy was crossing into Pennsylvania. The men had been quiet most of the ride, speaking only when necessary. Each of them carried their own reasons for being here. Some thought of the people who'd once stood for them. Others thought of the times they'd come home and found only silence. They would not let Anna Morris feel that kind of silence. Back in Pine Hollow, the hospital was just beginning to stir. Nurses made their rounds, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the halls. Anna sat up slowly, her side protesting the movement. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to shake off the dream she'd been having. One where she was back in the park, hearing the footsteps behind her again. Hank arrived not long after, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, managing a small smile. "You look stronger today," he said. "I feel less like I'm going to tip over," she said. They talked for a while, mostly about small things, the garden behind her house, the diner, the way the lilacs on Main Street would be blooming soon. Neither of them mentioned the attack. When he left, she leaned back against the pillows and closed her eyes, unaware that just a few hours and one long hallway would separate her from the moment that would change how she saw herself forever. In the SUVs, Blake glanced at the clock on the dash. They would be there by mid-morning. He didn't rehearse his words. He didn't need to. Some things were better spoken in the moment. Behind him, one of the men, a tall, quiet figure named Torres, looked out the window at the fields passing by. "She doesn't know us," he said. "No," Blake replied. "But she stood for us anyway." The rest of the ride was silent. At Pine Hollow General, the morning went on as usual. Doctors made their rounds. Visitors came and went. No one on staff had been told to expect 10 visitors arriving together. When the front doors opened and the men walked in, their formation unbroken, heads turned instantly. They moved without hurry, but with the kind of purpose you could feel in your chest. The receptionist glanced up, words catching in her throat. One of the nurses stepped out from behind the counter, watching as they passed. The sound of boots on tile echoed down the hallway, steady and sure. They turned the corner toward room 214. The sound came first. Boots on tile, slow, deliberate, each step ringing clear in the hospital hallway. Anna had been staring at the television mounted in the corner of her room, not watching the morning news so much as letting the voices fill the quiet. Her mind drifted, half on the weather report, half on the soreness in her ribs, until she caught it, that rhythm. It wasn't the soft shuffle of nurses in sneakers. It wasn't the quick steps of visitors coming and going. This was different. Steady, measured, certain. She looked toward the doorway just as the first shadow fell across it. 10 men came into view, 2 rows of 5, their posture perfect, their faces set in a way that spoke of years in service. They wore navy dress blues, the sharp lines of the uniforms a striking contrast against the sterile white of the hospital walls. The lead man, silver at the temples, eyes sharp but calm, stepped forward. "Ma'am." His voice was deep, the kind that carried without being raised. "We came to thank you." For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Her gaze flicked from him to the others behind him, their eyes locked forward, their hands resting neatly at their sides. She could feel the air shift in the room, as if the space had drawn tighter around them. I don't understand," she said finally. Her voice felt small in her own ears. "You don't know us," the man said, "but one of ours knows you. And we don't forget things like that." He stepped closer. His name tag read Blake. There was no hesitation in the way he looked at her, no searching for what to say. The words seemed ready, carried here with purpose. "I just did what anyone would do," Anna said. His mouth curved, just barely. "No, ma'am. Not anyone." From inside his jacket, he pulled a folded American flag. It was crisp, the edges perfect, the fabric holding the weight of care and ceremony. He didn't hand it to her yet. He held it between them, letting its presence speak. Anna's eyes shifted from the flag to his face. Why would you? Because you stood for one of ours, Blake said. And we stand for you. The room was silent except for the hum of the machines beside her bed. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed to have faded. He placed the flag gently on the table beside her bed, as if it were made of glass. The moment his hand left it, she felt the weight of it settle into the space. Not heavy in the way it sat, but heavy in what it meant. She blinked quickly, her throat tight. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Blake replied. You've already done it. Behind him, the other 9 men stood as still as statues. One of them, a younger man with dark hair, glanced her way for a fraction of a second before returning his eyes to the front. The look was quick, but she caught it. Not pity, not sorrow, but respect. Blake straightened. We won't keep you long. We just wanted you to know we saw what you did. And we don't forget. Anna swallowed, still unsure how to take in the moment. She wanted to tell them she wasn't brave, that she'd only done what she hoped someone else would do in her place. But she could see in their eyes that nothing she said would change the way they saw her. Blake gave a small nod to the man at his right. The younger SEAL stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. He set it on the table beside the flag and opened it just enough for her to see the gleam inside. A challenge coin, heavy and polished, bearing the insignia of their unit. This, Blake said, is something we give to our own. You've earned it. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for it. The coin was cool against her palm, solid in a way that made the moment feel anchored, real. Blake and the men stood for another quiet beat, the kind of pause that felt almost like a salute without movement. Then, as one, they turned and began to leave, their boots striking the floor in perfect unison. Anna watched them go until they disappeared around the corner. Only then did she look down at the flag and the coin on her table. She traced the edge of the coin with her thumb, feeling the ridges and grooves, the engraved words she couldn't stop reading. For the rest of the morning, her room stayed quiet. Nurses came and went softly, glancing at the flag without asking. Hank arrived just after noon, leaning heavier on his cane than usual. He took one look at the table, then at her, and his face broke into a slow smile. They came, he said simply. Anna nodded. They came. Hank walked to the table, his hand hovering just above the flag before pulling back. That's not something they do for just anyone, he said. That's them telling you you're part of the family now. I don't feel like I belong in their company, she said quietly. He eased into the chair beside her bed. You do. You proved it before you even knew it. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the visit settling in. Anna knew she'd never forget the sound of those boots in the hallway, the way the air had shifted when they arrived, the steady eyes of the man who had spoken for them all. And though she didn't feel like a hero, she understood now that sometimes, what you feel doesn't change what something means to others. The flag stayed on her table for the rest of her recovery. The coin never left her nightstand after she went home. And the memory of that morning, the rhythm of boots on tile, the quiet respect in their voices, became something she carried, not as proof of what she'd done, but as a reminder of why she'd done it in the first place. Because you don't leave your own behind. And she hadn't. The days after the SEAL's visit passed differently. Anna noticed it first in the way the nurses spoke to her, softer, with a kind of respect that went beyond politeness. Visitors she didn't know would glance into her room as they walked by, their eyes catching on the folded flag on her bedside table. A few paused in the doorway, as if they wanted to say something, but most simply nodded and moved on. The flag stayed exactly where Commander Blake had placed it, the challenge coin resting on top. She'd pick it up sometimes, running her thumb over the ridges of the design, the weight of it solid in her palm. It wasn't the coin itself that mattered, but what it stood for, a silent acknowledgement from men who had nothing to gain by coming here except to let her know they'd seen her. Hank came every afternoon, as he had since the first day. He'd sit in the same chair, cane resting against the bed, and talk about everything except the attack. Sometimes he told stories about his service. Other times he talked about the weather, the town, the garden she'd left untended in her backyard. You know, he said one afternoon, there are people who spend their whole lives wondering if they'd do the right thing when it mattered. You don't have to wonder anymore. Anna looked down at her bandaged arm. I don't feel like a hero, Hank. Most real heroes don't, he said. That's what makes them different. A week later, she was discharged. Leaving the hospital felt strange. The sunlight was too bright, the air too sharp after the controlled climate inside. Ruth drove her home in the old sedan, and as they turned onto their street, Anna saw the change before they even reached the house. On the porch were small signs, hand-painted words like "Thank you, Anna, and we're proud of you." Bouquets of flowers rested on the steps. There were envelopes tucked into the screen door. When she stepped out of the car, Mrs. Davis from next door came over with a covered dish. "You gave us all something to be proud of," she said. Anna didn't know how to respond. She just thanked her and carried the dish inside. Life slowly returned to its rhythm. The first week home, she stayed mostly inside, her body still stiff, her wounds tender. But by the second week, she ventured into the backyard, checking the small garden she'd left behind. The early shoots were coming up, stubborn against the spring chill. Hank visited twice a week now, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just keeping her company. They didn't need to talk about the seals. The memory was there, unspoken but present, in the way Hank would glance at the coin on her mantle or nod toward the folded flag. At the diner, word of her return spread quickly. Mabel herself called to say the regulars missed her. "Only so many times I can hear them complain about the coffee before I start sending them home," she joked. It would be another month before Anna felt ready to go back to work, but the thought of it brought her comfort. The diner was her place. The hum of the grill, the clink of plates, the rhythm of pouring coffee. One Tuesday morning, she decided to walk down Main Street for the first time since the attack. The air was crisp, the sky clear. People she'd known for years stopped her along the way. Some shook her hand, others hugged her carefully, mindful of her healing side. At the diner, she slipped inside, and the familiar scent of brewed coffee wrapped around her like a blanket. A few customers turned in their seats, smiling or nodding. She felt a warmth she hadn't realized she'd been missing. In the corner booth sat Hank, his navy cap back in place. When he saw her, he grinned and motioned for her to come over. "Thought you'd forgotten where this place was," he said. "Not a chance," she replied. She slid into the booth across from him. For a while, they talked about nothing in particular: the lilacs blooming on Main, the baseball game that had run too long the night before. But every so often, Hank's gaze would flick to her arm, then back to her face, as if to reassure himself she was really okay. Months passed, and the story became something people spoke about less often, but never completely forgot. The folded flag found a permanent place on her mantle, the challenge coin beside it. Sometimes she'd catch herself looking at them in the quiet of the evening. The memory of that morning as sharp as if it had happened yesterday. The sound of boots in the hallway, Blake's voice saying, "We stand for you." She never saw the seals again, but that wasn't the point. They hadn't come to start something. They'd come to mark it, to make sure she understood her actions mattered. And she did. One late summer afternoon, as she was closing up at the diner, a man she didn't recognize came in. He was tall, wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans, a baseball cap pulled low. He ordered coffee to go, then paused before paying. "You're Anna Morris, right?" he asked. She hesitated. "Yes." He smiled faintly. "I served with Commander Blake. He told us about you." Surprise flickered across her face. "You know him?" "Knew him a long time," the man said. "He doesn't talk about much outside the job, but he talked about you." Anna didn't know what to say. She handed him his coffee, and as he turned to go, he said, "He was right. You're the real deal." When the door closed behind him, she stood for a moment in the quiet, the words settling into her chest like a second heartbeat. Back home that night, she lit a single lamp in the living room. The flag and coin caught the glow, their shapes sharp in the soft light. She thought about how her life had changed, not in big, dramatic ways, but in the small shifts that mattered most. People saw her differently now, but more importantly, she saw herself differently. She knew, without doubt, that when it mattered, she'd acted, not because she was fearless, but because some things were worth the risk. Some heroes wear uniforms, some wear aprons, some carry rifles, and some carry coffee pots. But courage doesn't care about the clothes you wear. It lives in the choices you make when someone needs you. Anna Morris made her choice in a small-town park. And because of that choice, 10 Navy SEALs walked through a hospital hallway to tell her what the world now knows: you don't leave your own behind. If this story moved you, rate it out of 10 in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. and leave a note of thanks for our veterans. And if you want more true American hero stories, tap the next video. It autoplays.